Chapter 6, Screencast on the muscular system. We're going to focus on the introduction to the muscular system and the characteristics of muscles, the function of the muscular system, and the microscopic anatomy of muscle tissue. Where did this textbook get this picture, my old college picture in there? Looks like the original too. It's not like it's been doctored up or anything. I'm just trying to see if anybody actually watches these screencasts. So muscles of the body are responsible for all types of body movement. The obvious movements you would think about when you're talking about running, jumping, pushing, whatever, moving your arms and limbs, all of those movements are caused by the muscles. Your heartbeat is also caused by a muscle. That movement of your heart is muscle contraction. And also movement of things in your, say, your digestive system or cardiovascular system. The smooth muscle also moves things. Even things like facial expressions, they're all caused by muscle contractions. An important thing to point out terminology-wise is that muscle cells are referred to as muscle fibers. That really comes about from developmental stages of the body where muscle fibers actually come from the fusion of developing cells called myoblasts, two word parts, myo and blast, that you should be familiar with. And so a typical muscle cell is referred to as a muscle fiber. This is really the basics of the comparisons of the three different types of muscle tissue in the human body. In this chapter, though, we are going to focus on skeletal muscle. We're going to focus on this. In the cardiovascular system, we'll take a little closer look at cardiac muscle, but we're going to focus on skeletal muscle. You should just have an idea of the major characteristics, which is review from the tissues unit, major characteristics and differences between the three different types of muscle tissue. So muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells specifically, are multinucleate. Again, this comes from the developmental stages of the myoblasts fusing together, and the nuclei remain in those muscle fibers. They're also striated. In fact, striated muscle is interchangeable with the term skeletal muscle. You'll see that in different sources. And we refer to skeletal muscle as being voluntary. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be moved as a part of an involuntary reflex, but we still refer to it as voluntary, so it's subject to conscious control. One thing to keep straight is this hierarchy of the connective tissue banding or wrappings of skeletal muscle. So there's actually, I said it's a hierarchy, it's because there is a more broad term that wraps the entire muscle, and then there's a specific term for the connective tissue that wraps a fiber. So using the word parts, you should keep these things straight. But endomysium is the connective tissue that surrounds one individual fiber. Now, it's not the cell membrane. That's something different. But this is a connective tissue wrapping that covers the cell. Perimysium is actually a bundle, or covers a bundle of individual cells. It surrounds what's called a fascicle. Then epimysium, it covers the entire skeletal muscle. So it actually covers the bundles of fascicles. So you may want to pause this slide and take a look at this and refer to the picture. So what makes these connective tissues really strong is that they are actually all continuous, and they all end up being a part of a tendon, which is continuous with, remember, the dense connective tissue that makes up the covering of a bone. So this muscle tissue covering actually is continuous with the periosteum of bone tissue. Makes for a very strong junction between muscle and bone. Two different types of attachment points. The one you're probably most familiar with would be the tendons, and those are basically specific points that connect muscle tissue to bone. But there's also aponeuroses, or an aponeurosis, that's kind of like a roll of paper towel or a roll of saran wrap, where it's more sheet-like. Most of these are kind of coverings or attachment points of muscle holding it to other muscles. General muscle functions include these four things. Of course, this is probably pretty obvious that they produce movement. They help you maintain posture by not necessarily random, but all sorts of different muscle contractions at different times that stabilize the neck joint, the torso joint, etc. to maintain a posture. Of course, they stabilize joints. Most and many muscles, the origin and insertion actually cross over a joint so that the belly of the muscle, the tissue of the muscle, it crosses a joint. And then one real important aspect of muscle tissue is the generation of heat and maintaining of body heat and its role in thermoregulation. The more muscle movement that you have, the more heat that is going to be given off. And essentially, mostly that comes about from, to keep it simple, the second law of thermodynamics, that you're converting energy from one form into another. So as you're converting chemical energy into actual mechanical energy, just like every other energy conversion, there's going to be energy that is lost, that is not recoverable. Basically, useless energy in the form of heat. Now, it is useful to humans and organisms that need to maintain an internal body temperature, that they use that to help regulate their body temperature. So here we're looking at one muscle fiber. The muscle fiber itself has a specialized plasma membrane, or in other words, a specialized cell membrane. That special name is a sarcolemma. The myofibrils are the organelles that are inside the muscle cell or the muscle fiber itself. These are actually the long organelles or the long cell parts that do the shortening. And sarcoplasmic reticulum is specialized endoplasmic reticulum. We'll get to its function a little later, but these are important aspects of a muscle fiber. The myofibrils, they're aligned to give distinct bands. You can actually see these, and you can see them on a light microscope when you look at a slide of skeletal muscle. You have a light band and a dark band. Now, for our purposes, we're not going to call them A bands and I bands. We'll just say light and dark, because that's what they actually are, what the appearance is. You can use this little example that I've got. I keep them straight by thinking about the I in light and the A in dark to remember which is which. But they're overlapped. They have overlapped proteins that are kind of like when you interlace your fingers, and where there's overlap, you have a darkness. Where there's not overlap, it's more of a light pattern, and it's not as thick or dense at that point. So they give kind of an alternated light and dark appearance to them. That's what gives rise to the striations in muscle tissue. In understanding the actual physical anatomy of what's going on when a muscle contracts, this is a very important term, a sarcomere. This is the ultimate contraction, unit of contraction in muscle tissue. It is the ultimate contractile unit. So in a sarcomere, it's basically made up of two filaments called actin and myosin. The thin filaments here in blue are actin filaments, and the thick filaments are called myosin. And they overlap, again, kind of like we are lacing our fingers together. So you would see where there would be a dark line because of the overlap, and where there would be a light band, again, the light and dark bands, because of the overlapping of these fibers. These are the fibers, these are the filaments, the protein filaments, that actually slide by one another during muscle contraction and muscle shortening. A comparison between the two filaments, the myosin being the thick and the actin being the thin filaments, again, these are the filaments, these are the proteins that slide by one another. And in fact, they more than kind of slide by one another, one of them kind of grabs onto the other and pulls, which causes the shortening. Now we're going to talk more about the physiology of what actually happens during muscle contraction or the shortening of a muscle. But for now, these two filaments, these two protein molecules, They grab onto each other essentially, and they pull. So they will end up shortening, kind of like the way you would play tug of war or pull on a rope. As you pull on the rope hand over hand, the rope, you're going to pull something at the end closer to you. And that's a lot how the physiology of muscle contraction that we'll talk about later happens. So here's a picture of a sarcomere again, and recall that we've got the thick filament and the thin filament sort of overlapping, and on the thick filament you can see these myosin heads, these little things that are sticking out from the edge of them. They kind of look like the head of a golf club to me. But what happens with proper amounts of energy and some other compounds in the muscle tissue itself, what these will do is grab onto the thin filament and they will pull. So essentially, they're going to pull in this direction. As those Z discs, as those structures move closer together, the muscle sarcomere is shortening. And eventually, ultimately, the entire muscle organ is shortening. The importance of this slide is just showing you a drawing or a diagram of the difference between a relaxed sarcomere and a contracted or shortened sarcomere. So again, I'm not concerned with knowing the A band, H zone, or things like that, but on the left is a sarcomere that is at rest. And as you can notice, the endpoints, called the Z discs of the sarcomere, are a certain distance apart, and they have shortened in this diagram. The Z disc to Z disc distance has shortened, and as you can see, there is actually an overlap. So again, on the left-hand side, you see a relaxed or elongated sarcomere. On the right is a contracted sarcomere. So in review, you can go back, again, review, stop, pause, rewind this screencast to take a look at any of these things and review any of the material and pick up anything that you missed. But you should be able to do these 4 things after watching the screencast. Describe the characteristics of skeletal muscle. You should be able to identify the structures in a microscopic view of skeletal muscle tissue. Explain the role of the myofibrils and the myofilaments, what they do. We'll talk more about muscle contraction in a screencast later on, and also describe the growth structure. Be able to talk about the anatomy of muscle tissue, including the connective tissue coverings, and be able to identify that on a given diagram.